Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our new career development webinar entitled Best Practices for Students, Postdocs, and their Faculty Mentors when Writing an NIH Individual Fellowship Grant Application. Let's get everyone settled for just a little bit to make sure we're all logged in, and then we'll get started. We do want to let everyone know that this webinar will be recorded and posted onto our YouTube channel. Before we get started, I'll be giving a brief intro about NRMN, the National Research Mentoring Network, and about our speaker, Dr. Jamie Rubin. Founded in 2014, NRMN is an NIH grant-funded initiative whose entire purpose is to diversify the STEM workforce. We do this by providing researchers across all career stages in the biomedical, behavioral, clinical, and social sciences field with evidence-based mentorship and professional development programming that emphasizes the benefits and challenges of diversity, inclusivity, and culture. Our program achieves that through mentorship, networking, and professional development through our online networking platform, MyNRMN, which currently has over 22,000 mentors and mentees. We encourage you to visit our website, nrmnet.net, to learn more about our resources. NRMN is thrilled to have Dr. Jamie Rubin join us for today's webinar. Just to tell you a little bit about her, Dr. Jamie Rubin is Vice Chair for Investigator Development and Professor of Medical Sciences in Columbia University's Department of Medicine. She has held a number of senior level positions at Columbia University's Irving Medical Center, including Acting Associate Dean for Graduate Affairs, having served as the founding director of the Office of Graduate Affairs and Acting Associate Vice President, Acting Associate Dean for Research Administration, having served as one of the founders of the Office of Research Administration. Not only has Dr. Rubin provided NRMN webinars on topics such as funding and grantsmanship, but she also presents at national conferences and institutions across the country, seeking to support the career development of their junior investigators and increase their extramural funding. NRMN is delighted to provide this opportunity for everyone to participate in this webinar and have your questions directly answered by Dr. Rubin. We will be offering a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so we encourage you to type in any questions by using the Q&A feature in the chat box down below. And from NRMN, we want to give a special thank you to Dr. Rubin for making this webinar happen. And now I will pass it over to her to begin the webinar.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the National Research Mentoring Network for sponsoring and holding today's session. I'm also thrilled to be here and to make this contribution to this important effort. Let me try and share my slides. I hope you can see my slides now.
Yes, you can see it.
Let's just. Is it a single slide, I hope?
Yes.
Still a single slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So I always like to start with a sort of table of contents or topics to be discussed, because it also reminds me to tell you that when you start completing one of these NIH or any other funding agency's grant applications, it's good for you to start with an outline or a table of contents for each of the different sections of the grant application. And I will tell you that in some parts of this presentation, where it's going to be at a very granular and very detailed level as we go through the different components of the application. And then I will end with more general overview comments on how to develop a competitive application. And just to start by saying that NIH has a long-standing effort to increase diversity and increase diversity in the biomedical workforce and recent efforts against structural racism in biomedical research. Our large effort in this regard is Unite, and you can see that enhancing the scientific workforce diversity is one of the elements of this effort. There's a strategic plan in this regard, and NIH has invited comments and suggestions. A strategic plan to diversify the scientific workforce. There's a request for information on how to put together and implement a NIH-wide effort in this regard. NIH has had a long-standing interest in diversity. This is their latest notice in this regard. Diversity statement. Scientists and trainees from diverse backgrounds and life experiences bring different perspectives, creativity, and individual enterprise to address complex scientific problems. There are different categories, if you will, that are recognized: individuals from racial and ethnic groups, individuals with disabilities, individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds, and also women in these different categories. NIH has recently expanded the definition of socioeconomic disadvantage to make this category more inclusive, and more individuals would meet the eligibility criteria. NIH recently sent out a notice reminding everybody and encouraging folks to apply for NIH funding. There's that notice in yellow there, the notice of interest in diversity that I just spoke about. Diversity within the NIH-supported workforce fosters innovation, enhances global competitiveness, improves the quality of research and research outcomes. NIH reaffirms their commitment to supporting a sustainable and diverse biomedical workforce, and recognizes that individuals from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, as well as individuals with disabilities, are strongly encouraged to apply for funding from the NIH. There's the very large NIH-wide diversity program consortium, a network, if you will, to transform institutional culture, enhance diversity, from undergraduate programs all the way through the different career stages to postdoctoral training. And of course, NRMN is one of the most important and largest components as part of this effort. So today we're going to focus on the different NIH fellowship or F funding mechanisms. So to start with an overview, realize that all the different funding mechanisms that NIH offers, they all have different mission statements, they provide different types of funding, and they're for different periods of time. So the fellowships that we're going to talk about today, the Fs, if you will, provide stipend support for those that are awardees. I'm going to give an example of, let's say, a 3-year postdoctoral fellowship, but they're for defined periods of time. So where do they fall within sort of the career path of a biomedical scientist? So when you're in graduate school or a doctoral program, for example, there are different ways to be supported. You can be on your mentor's research grant, you can be on an NIH training grant, or you can hold one of these fellowships, which in NIH speak is an F31. And then let's say during your postdoctoral training, the same different types of funding to support this training in NIH speak for the individual fellowship, that would be the F32. There's a relatively new funding mechanism to help and support individuals as they transition from their senior postdoc years to their senior pre-doc years, to their postdoc years. In NIH speak, that's called an F99 K00, where the F99 component is during the senior years of being a graduate student, and the K00 are those postdoc years. For any of you that might be clinically trained, let's say you went to medical school and managed to find some time to do research, let's say in the summer between first and second year. And some of you might be MD, PhD students supported by an individual fellowship. In NIH speak, that's an F30. Maybe you found time to do research when you were an intern or a resident or hoping to. And similarly, during your clinical fellowship years, there are a number of programs that have dedicated fellowship years within that clinical fellowship And you can also similarly be supported by an individual fellowship or F32. This is a listing of all the different funding programs that I just mentioned, the F30, the F31, and the F32. And I wanted to point out that for the F31, the Predoc Fellowship, there are two different funding announcements, and one specifically to enhance or promote diversity in the biomedical workforce. So just a very quick couple of bullets, 3 bullets, if you will, overview of these fellowship programs. So the pre-doc supports individuals that are in doctoral programs. What kind of funding does it provide? It provides stipend for the individual, for the fellow, their tuition costs, an institutional allowance, which many times is used for health fees, to pay for health insurance, or travel to go to a national meeting to present their results of their fellowship research, and a new budget category is childcare. Now, one of the things that's not listed there that you might notice is the research costs. The cost of doing the research. There's no money there for animals or for reagents or anything like that. There is the expectation that the fellow, the trainee, will have a mentor who has NIH or other peer-reviewed funding that can pay for the research costs. Generally speaking, and I'm going to go through this in more detail, what are the review criteria? The review criteria is about the individual fellow, the trainee, the mentor, the other co-mentor or collaborators that are involved, the research project that's proposed, and the research training and career development activities and environment. In terms of looking at things in terms of success rate a little quantitatively, so the dark blue is the number of applications, the lighter blue is the number of awards, and the red is the success rate over time. Now, this is NIH as a whole, and one can really drill down onto their webpage. And just to give you an idea, I know you can't all see this in such detail, but this is the success rate for pre-doc fellowships by each individual NIH institute. So I've just highlighted the Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Disease Institute. And there you can see that for the last year that they have posted, 2020, the success rate is about 34%. And you can even, if you wanted to focus on NIDDK, you can see the success rate going back 10 years. And I just want to say that there are lots of other funding agencies that also support pre-doc and postdoc fellowships. And in some sense, they're very similar. And the same folks that review for NIH review for these non-government, nonprofit agencies. So I'm just picking out one as an example from the American Heart Association. And you can see that in some regards, it's very similar. One difference is that while the NIH fellowship requires the individual who's being supported to be a US citizen or permanent resident, many times these non-government agencies do not have the same citizenship requirement. And here's an example of one that does not. Similarly, the F30 for the MD PhD students, the same kind of budgetary items, review criteria, and so forth. And eligibility criteria is that they're in a dual degree program. I also mentioned the F99 K00, where they transition from senior graduate student to a postdoctoral position. The F99 is the 1 to 2 years to complete graduate school, and the K00 are the postdoc years. It's not supported by too many institutes. Let's hope this continues to increase in number. But this is the success rate in the different institutes right now, up to 4, that support what I think is a very powerful funding mechanism. So moving along the timeline, as I discussed, there's the postdoc fellowship in NIH speak, the F32, and this supports individuals already with a doctoral degree. It could be a PhD, it could be MD, it could be PhD and MD, and so forth. Could even be in a degree program. There are sometimes, let's say, MD postdocs or MD trained who might want to get a master's degree in biostatistics or epidemiology. In terms of the success rate of F32s, this gives you an idea over time, composite of across NIH. In terms of postdoc fellowships, the success rate, there's NIDDK right there, 26.4% in 2020. It's mislabeled at the top. It should be postdocs. And there's the NIDDK F32 over time, over the last 10 years. Some might question, what's the success rate of those that are PhD trained versus those that are postdoc trained? Well, as you can see right there, the success rate is fairly equivalent. Those that are MD trained are not at a disadvantage in terms of the success rate. I also wanted to sort of highlight in terms of numbers of awards. So there's the Predoc Fellowships, that sort of teal color there by the red arrow, and that lighter sort of olive green is the number of postdoc fellowships. And another point I wanted to make in terms of the postdoc fellowships, you can see there in 2000, there were less than half Predoc Fellowship awards than postdocs, and this has continued to climb over time, where among the individual fellowships, there appears to be more than twice as many Predoc fellowships than postdoc fellowships. In terms of the stipend level, this is the last stipend level that's been issued. We're waiting for the fiscal year 2022 numbers, but this is the stipend level that the fellowships offer for predocs. It doesn't matter what year in your graduate study you are, everybody receives the same stipend rate. In terms of postdocs, this was a slide put together by the National Postdoc Association. You can see that one starts out right out of graduate school with 0 years experience, and with more years of experience, the stipend level does increase. This is what the funding announcements look like. And here, this is for the F31, what's called the parent F31. And you can see all the different institutes across NIH that are listed, meaning that they support this funding program. And then there's the diversity F31, also supported across NIH by all the different institutes. And you can probably find the NIH institute that would be relevant for your research: the National Cancer Institute, Institute of Mental Health, nursing, diabetes and digestive and kidney diseases, and so forth. For this funding mechanism or funding announcement to promote diversity, there's the same sort of categories that I listed before. Individuals from different racial and ethnic groups. Here they're listed. Can change from setting to setting. Individuals with disabilities, individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds that meet 2 or more of those different categories that I mentioned. This is the funding announcement for the MD PhD students. This is for individuals that are studying at an institution that has their own sort of training grant for MD PhD students. There's a limited number of institutes that support this one. And for those of you that are from institutes that don't have a training grant, there's a larger number of institutes that support it. This is the funding announcement for the postdoc, the F32 Fellowship. And one of the things I wanted to point out is there's always an exception, if you will. So if you look here, the Neurologic Institute should be right there alphabetically. Well, in fact, they don't support the parent F32. The Neurologic Disease and Stroke Institute has issued their own funding announcement for postdoc fellowships for the F32, because they want to fund folks that are very junior. For instance, if you could look 12 months prior to the start, the application should not, they're discouraging applications that include preliminary data. They want an emphasis on quantitative training. So in fact, they don't support the parent announcement because they wanted to issue their own that had special requirements. There's been a number of task force reports by the NIH. This is an example of the Biomedical Workforce Task Force and some of their bullet point suggestions. And you'll see that this during my discussion, to put into IDPs or individual development plans in place for all trainees, reduce the length of graduate training, and have F30 and F31 award programs from all of the institutes. That was not true at the beginning. As we move to the next section, let me just see if there's a couple of questions in the chat. Now there's 3 questions. Yes, MDs can apply. Is the F31 available for MDs with no PhD? Absolutely. You have a doctoral degree, so you would apply for the F32. After you've completed your MD, you would apply for the F32. What is the difference between the F31 diversity and the F31? That would be for individuals that meet those different criteria that I mentioned in those different categories. For the F31 pre-doc grant stipend, what happens if the stipend amount is less than your school stipend? I think you need to go talk to your school. Some schools will supplement the NIH fellowship up to the school's stipend level. So you should talk to them. Could you mention the residency criteria in each grant? I think you mean that does one need to be a permanent resident or citizen for the Fs? And the answer is yes. That was the chat. All right, so let me now go through the NIH grant review process, and then we will talk about the application itself, because I think it's always important to understand the application process and especially the review criteria before you start writing the grant, right? You want to understand what are the reviewers looking for, what's their criteria, or they've been instructed what is their criteria as you write the grant. So NIH has 3 cycles a year for deadlines: April 8th, August 8th, and December 8th. 3 different cycles. Many other agencies only have 1 or 2 deadlines a year. And the other thing to highlight is if you don't get funded the first time, you can submit a resubmission where you respond to the reviewer's comments. Unlike research grants, these have the same deadline. And if you're doing AIDS-related research, you have your own set of deadlines. So the NIH grant review process is sort of a long process. Let's say it's about 9 months. And if we look at cycle 3, let's say you applied in December or so, about 3 months until you hear from study section to get your score. About 3 months later, it'll go to the institute's council, let's say the council at NCI or the council at the I Institute, that makes the funding decision, yes or no. And then about, 3 months later or so, you'll get the notice of grant award. So this is my little representation of NIH, where here are all the different institutes, the National Cancer Institute, the Genome Research Institute, and so forth. The vast majority of them have some disease focus. And down there is that Center for Scientific Review. And I put a circle around it to remind me to tell you that this is where the vast majority of the grants are reviewed, the fellowships are reviewed. So even if, let's say, the NCI pays for the grant, if you will, or puts up the funding, the grant will be reviewed at the Center for Scientific Review, not the Institute. And in fact, one summer, they were a bit shorthanded, and I went down to Washington and acted as a review administrator for a fellowship study section. In fact, it was an oncology-related fellowship study section. So after the review process, the Center for Scientific Review, if you will, sends out the grants to the different institutes with their scores and the comments, and then the different institutes make the decision on which grants to fund based on their pay line, based on their programmatic considerations, and so forth. The Center for Scientific Review has issued a draft strategic plan, and I like this figure because it represents the difference in terms of the total number of applications received and those that are reviewed at the Center for Scientific Review. So here you can see that there were about 5,600 fellowship applications received in that year. About 83% of them were reviewed at the Center for Scientific Review, and a portion of them, in fact, were reviewed at the institutes. So this is a representation of a study section, the reviewers, and they come together, and you get at the end about a 10-page document that was called a summary statement or a pink sheet, or the reviewer's comments back maybe about 6 weeks. So you'll get the score just a couple of days after their committee meets, with the strengths and weaknesses that they have identified in your application. So it is very important that your grant end up in the right study section. This is I think, an unfortunately overlooked point. You want your grant to end up in a study section where the reviewers have the right expertise to realize all of the exciting research that you're proposing. So this is a list. I know it's a little hard to see, but we'll drill down. This is a list of the different fellowship study sections that are within the Center for Scientific Review. So if I just highlight here 3 of the study sections, F07, A, B, and C, that are focused on infectious disease and immunology. And I pick one of them, F07A. You'll see lots of information on the webpage, the different topics or review areas that fall under the purview of this study section, shared interests that overlap with other study sections. Maybe this isn't the right study section for you for what you're proposing, but it lists other study sections which might be better choices. You can even see the list of reviewers at the different study sections, which you can see they meet every 4 or 5 months. You can see the list of reviewers, because that'll give you an idea, is this the right study section for you? Maybe you recognize some names, or your mentor recognizes some names because they're in your field. Do not contact the reviewers. They're just listed there for informational purposes. Another way to check if that's the right study section, you're all probably familiar with NIH Reporter, which is their online database, but you probably never noticed that field right there where you can select a study section. So here I selected F07, the Immunology and Infectious Disease Study section. I hit search, and I got a list when I did this of 65 fellowships that were active and that went through that study section. So these were successful applications, and you can see their F32s, F30s, F31s that were funded and went through that study section. And you can see the titles, you can see the abstracts, maybe you recognize some names. And if they look like your research, then maybe that's the right study section. If it doesn't look like what you're proposing, then you should perhaps start again and try and find the right study section for you. And then when you do find the right study section, this used to be listed in a cover letter. It is no longer listed in a cover letter. Complete this optional form. Not a requirement, but I think it's a very good idea. The PHS assignment request form. So there's 4 components. So you would say, let's say, the very top, what institute? So maybe it's the Allergy and Infectious Disease Institute. What study section? F07. And then at the bottom, why? And give some reasons of how they relate to your specific aims, which we will discuss. And then this 4th section, where you can put in up to 5 keywords or keyword phrases, up to 40 characters, adding additional keywords or phrases that will help the review administrator make the assignment. So now you've got to the right study section, but there's 25 people there. And the review administrator is going to select 3 people to be the main reviewers of your grant. So help the review administrator do this by putting in keywords there to help them make the best match, if you will, between your application and the different reviewers. Let me see if some of these questions in the chat. Somebody's asking about the length of the F31. Maybe some of these are a little bit more. Maybe I'll go through the questions a little bit later. Maybe the content will help answer some of these questions. So what is the scoring system, if you will? About half of the applications are discussed at the study section and about half are not. Those that are discussed receive what's called an impact score, an overall impact score. All of the applications, whether they're discussed or not, receive that 10-page or so set of reviewers' comments, and they all receive what I would call, let's say, sub-impact scores for the different review criteria. The impact scores are 1 to 9 whole integers. The lower the number, the better, if you will. This provides a little bit more information in terms of what these different impact scores mean. And I would say that one needs to be in the sort of 1, 2, or 3 range to, perhaps be in the fundable range. In terms of the overall impact score, each of the reviewers offers a score. I'm going to give it a 1, a 2, or 3, and so forth. Then the mean is taken of all of the 20 or so people at study section and multiplied by 10. So if you get a 20, don't think, how did this happen? There's only 1 to 9. In fact, that means that the average was 2.0 and they multiplied by 10 to get 20. So where does this fit in terms of the pay line of the different institutes? So here's an example over time of the pay line from the Allergy and Infectious Disease Institute for the different fellowships. And there you can see 19 for the F31 in 2021, meaning it was 1.9. So this person probably got a mixture of 1s and 2s from the different reviewers. Heart, lung, and blood does it a little differently. They don't use the impact score to determine their pay line. They use what's instead is the percentile ranking, which is a measure of how that grant did in regard to the other grants reviewed at that study section. So the fellowship review criteria is the next topic, and this is very important because this is how you write the grant, and this is how you respond to the reviewer's comments, to the reviewer's criteria. So you need to know what they are. So the fellowship application is a research project that's integrated with a training plan. And the reviewers will look for the applicant's potential for a career as a productive independent scientist in academia, and whether the proposed training and the research project, the training plan, are well integrated and they're at a supportive environment, an institution, as well as having a mentor. They use the term sponsor. I use the term mentor or co-mentor, collaborators and co-investigators that will help them in 2 ways. 1, during this research training plan, and 2, as they transition to the next career stage. So each of the discussed applications get that overall impact score, which is sort of the overall feeling of the reviewer has about that applicant, about that application. There are 5 main review criteria, and there will be sub-impact scores for each of those these 5 areas. And we're going to go through them in some detail because this is how you write the grant application. And they will talk about, in terms of bullet points, strengths and weaknesses for the individuals. The fellowship applicant, that's you, the graduate student, the med student, the postdoc, the mentors, the collaborators, the consultants, the co-investigators, the individuals, the supporting individuals that the applicant has surrounded themselves with. The research training plan, which is the research that's proposed, the potential of that individual for a successful career in academic research, and the institutional commitment and environment where the research training is taking place. So what about the applicant? Their academic record, their previous research experiences, the potential to develop into an independent and productive investigator, the academic environment and the commitment to that individual's success, continued success, the individual's role in that research training plan, their contribution, is it appropriate for their career stage? So of course, it would be different for a graduate student than for a postdoc. And then what about the mentors and the collaborators and co-investigators? It's all about what they can do for the applicant, not what the applicant can do for the mentor's grant, the mentor's papers, the mentor's promotions, tenure, the mentor's research program. It's about what the mentors, collaborators, and so forth can do for the individual. So the research qualifications of the mentor and their track record of being a mentor themselves. Have they mentored people at this career stage? Have they mentored people successfully who've gone on to be successful academic investigators? Have they helped individuals successfully make that transition to the next career stage? Is there a match between their research interests? Does the mentor show during their statement that they really understand the training gaps and the training needs that the fellow is trying to achieve during this research training? And how will the mentor help them fill those gaps or meet those needs? Do they have funding, right? So there's no money in a fellowship to support paying for mice or buying reagents. Do they have grants themselves that will support the trainees' research efforts? And if there's more than one mentor or co-mentor and so forth, have they mentored previously together or collaborated together? How are they going to integrate their individual roles and responsibilities? And what about the other individuals involved? The collaborators, the co-investigators, and so forth. Do they have the expertise and the background to fulfill their roles and responsibilities? If there are special rules with regard if a clinical and trial is involved in the research. It doesn't usually happen, but if there does. Is there going to be, outstanding training and career development and mentoring? Is there an expectation that the individual is going to be able to go to national meetings and present their research results, publish good papers in good journals? And the research training plan, is the research of high quality? Is it integrated within the training or the career development activities? What about the prior research that serves as the foundation for what's proposed? Is that rigorous? If there are some problems in this regard, how are they being mitigated? This is all part of NIH's larger effort, true also for research grants, of addressing rigor and reproducibility. So what are the plans to address, let's say, any problems or weaknesses in the prior research? And what about the mentees' plans for their research? Is it robust and will lead to unbiased results? Relevant biological variables, many times that's considered sex as a biological variable. How is that going to be addressed during the research? And what about, let's say, for postdocs, how distinct is what the individual is doing from the mentor? Are they going to be able to take their research with them, if you will, for the next career stage, when they're an academic independent scientist, when they have a faculty position? And is the research project appropriate for that career stage as well as time frame, right? So let's say a postdoc is supposed to be 3 years long. It can't be a 7-year project. Or the graduate student is supposed to graduate in 5 years. It can't be a 7-year project. So it has to be feasible, time-wise, career level-wise, and so forth. They're going to be able to publish again and go to national meetings. What about gaining the professional skills that they need to transition to the next career stage? Learning to give presentations, learning to be a mentor themselves, maybe learning to run labs, learning grant writing, and so forth. For individuals that are MD, PhD students, to integrate their transition back into their clinical years, or to integrate their clinical interests with their research interests. The training potential and activities. So there should be individualized programs and activities specific for that individual and that individual's gaps and needs and that individual's career stage and that individual's research goals and career goals. So it cannot be just sort of template language, if you will, from the institution or from the department. There needs to be sort of a program of activity, and we're going to talk about this in more detail, that's specific for that individual's interests, research interests, career goals, and needs, as such that when they finish with this research training program, they will successfully transition to the next stage and eventually develop to be an independent and productive academic investigator. And as I said, there are, special rules with regard to integrating the research and clinical training for MD, PhD students, and certainly for postdocs to learn the professional skills for their next career stage, like running a research group, being a mentor themselves, being a boss, to help them be an independent investigator, which is their next career stage. In terms of MD, PhD students, the same sort of thing, that there are expectations in terms of advising, institutional support, and so forth for these individuals that are in dual degree programs. So those are the 5 main review criteria, but there are also some other important ones, and I wanted to highlight resubmissions. Let's say you didn't get funded the first time. You need to submit what's called a resubmission or amended application. You need to respond comprehensively to the reviewer's comments in that second application. The reviewers of that second application will see the reviewer's comments from the first application, and they want to see that you have responded to the reviewer's comments. Additional review considerations: training in the responsible conduct of research. Is your mentor involved? And also sort of the period of support, as I mentioned, that it has to match your career stage, the research project that's being proposed, and so forth. And other guidance that is given to the reviewers on a technical nature. Your mentors should be very familiar with this, because this is also part of their research grant applications. They have a lot of information there. You can actually read the guidance that's given to the reviewers, so you know what to do when you're writing your own grant application. I just want to highlight one part about human subjects. For those of you that do research with human subjects, it used to be based on women, minorities, and children. It is now women, minorities, and individuals across the lifespan. Before, it was felt that older adults were not included in clinical research studies, and now they have to be. So the term now is across the lifespan. If you're doing research with clinical trials, there are additional rules and regulations. So before we talk about the components of the fellowship application, so now having applied what we've talked about in terms of the review criteria, I don't know, should we stop and take some questions, or should we continue?
Oh, so you can talk, you can go ahead and do some questions right now. That should be good.
Do you want
Did you want me to go ahead and read them off for you?
If you want to just pick a couple, and then we can address the rest some other point.
Okay, so let's see, right here we got.
Well, here's a question. This is maybe, what do you do with an applicant when they have a mentor who is not an experienced mentor? So sometimes this is a good time to bring in a co-mentor. If you have a mentor who's a junior investigator, they might not have mentoring experience, they might not have the research funding. So bring in a co-mentor, a more senior individual who has research funding, who has mentored a lot of people in the past, has mentored people at your career stage. Let's see. I'd like to trying to take questions that are of more general nature. How for an F31, how much can the applicant's proposal overlap with the mentor's funded research program? It can overlap to some degree because you're going to be funded by the mentor's R01. There can be, it should fall, let's say, within the broad definition, if you will, of the R01's specific aims. The question is it true that having too much experience hurts the applicant for the F31? Where we're going to show right here, this sort of leads into the components of the application where the individual demonstrates that they need. That's one of the things you need to do, is to demonstrate that you need this funding program. So make sure you're using the most current instructions. We're doing Forms G right now. So this is a PDF version of the instructions. I like the HTML version. It's easier to navigate. So just remember Forms G. So a couple of other changes. Emphasis on training and rigor and reproducibility. Emphasis on knowing quantitative approaches, data analysis, power analysis, and so forth. The same sort of thing in the research strategy. Addressing any problems of the rigor in the prior research, how to mitigate that, to demonstrate that in the research that you propose will lead to robust and unbiased results. A lot of times that has to do with proper study design, what are the different arms of the study? What's the control group in the study? We'll talk about this as your mentors probably too. Authenticating any key biological or chemical resources that you use. And if, let's say, you're applying for the diversity F31, that you demonstrate eligibility in the application. NIH has this very good web page showing all of the page limits of the components, because they all have page limits. And it's important when you write each of these components, keep an idea in mind as to what is the page limit, so that you don't go over, right? If something is 1 page, you don't want to write something that's 3 pages long and then have to cut. So this is the supplement form that's specific for fellowship applications. So you don't have to write in your first application the introduction. That's for amended applications, that second application. You don't do the progress report, right? Because this is a new application. So we start with section number 2, the fellowship applicant section. And this is very sort of a personal section. This is where you talk about yourself and your different research experiences, and you talk about them in chronological order and how your interests evolved, and you'd had this research experience as an undergraduate and then graduate school and then so forth. And this is where you are now. And this is where your interests are and your goals for your career. And it's just not a list. You should talk about how your interests evolved, what your role was in each of those projects, why you chose the next project, the next institution, the next mentor, and any recognition that you received, any papers that you were on, any presentations, any conferences that you presented at. And this section B talks about your training goals for the particular fellowship. So you identify any areas, conceptual approaches, skills that you need to learn during this fellowship period, right? I need to learn more about cancer. I need to learn more about bioinformatics. I need to learn more about imaging, or whatever it is, and how you are going to gain that knowledge base and that experience, and how the fellowship, this is very important, to successfully facilitate your transition to the next career stage. And then section C, after you've discussed what your needs are for this fellowship program, how you go specifically, what are your activities to fill those needs that you just described? So for instance, maybe put in a table such as this. Maybe there's 3 rows at the top, the scientific area. I need to learn more about bioinformatics. I need to learn more about clinical research. So who is going to help you? Who are the mentors and the advisors? What courses are you going to take? What workshops? What conferences are you going to attend that'll help you meet the gap that's described in that scientific area? And then the 4th row, that bottom row, is sort of everything else, if you will. All of the career development skill sets, learning to write grants, learning to give presentations, learning to be a mentor yourself, and so forth. And then maybe put together a timeline chart such as this. So this is a 3-year example, years 1, 2, and 3, when you're going to meet with your mentor, and be specific when you're going to meet with your mentor. We're going to meet Thursday mornings, 10:30 to 11:30. Be specific. Be specific about what you're going to discuss at each of those sessions. When we recommend everybody have an advisory group, many times graduate students already have a thesis defense group. How often are you going to meet with them? Quarterly or every 6 months? And what about your experimental training? And be specific on each of the different things you need to learn and who's going to help you learn them. And the courses that you're going to take. So usually you would front load the courses. So there'll be a course, let's say, in statistics. You would need to take at the beginning as you're setting up the experiments, and maybe you take biostatistics 2 later on, and so forth. Maybe you take a course on how to write grants later on as you transition or prepare to transition to the next career stage. Maybe in addition to formal courses, you go to the formal university courses at your institution, you go to workshops and other kinds of programs, and you go to conferences to present the results of your research. And you can see that you go to more conferences as you mature as an investigator, as you have more results. You become a mentor yourself. Maybe you're mentoring in the summertime undergraduate students or other students that pass through in the summer. You gain communication skills, like you're writing now journal articles and grant writing. Maybe there's an internal award program at your institution or a travel award. There's an application to go to one of these conferences. NIH has made it a requirement for these fellowship programs for everybody to have an IDP, or individual development plan. I don't think it's a bad thing at all. And I would say anybody in any field, it's probably a good thing to do. It's where you sort of think about yourself and your strengths and your weaknesses, what your career goals are, and how you can get from where you are today to that career goal, recognizing your strengths and weaknesses. They say that it's sort of a 4-step process, evaluating your skills and values and interests, using this as a self-assessment guide, and looking at all the different career opportunities there are. Not everybody's going to be a faculty member at a university. And then set milestones and goals to help you along that career path to meet that goal, and then finally get started. Just to say that as part of this effort in terms of rigor and reproducibility, they also would like those in fellowship training programs to receive formal training in quantitative aspects and statistics and so forth to enhance the rigor and reproducibility of their research. The research training plan, I mean, this is what you would work on with your mentor. There's 1 page for the specific aims and 6 pages for the research strategy. Make sure that it's appropriate for you, appropriate for your expertise, appropriate for your career goals, your career level, the length of that fellowship, and so forth. In terms of the specific aims, you would work on that with your mentor. The goals of the project, it helps when it's hypothesis driven. You're asking specific questions and how you're going to answer them. And then there are 6 pages of the research strategy that are broken up into the significance, the importance of the problem, the critical barrier to advancing the field, recognizing the strengths and weaknesses of the rigor of the prior research, how what you're proposing is going to improve the scientific field, how the field will be changed when your research project has achieved its goals, the approach that you're going to use, the methodologies, the data analysis, how you're going to address any rigor problems with weaknesses and rigor of the prior research, your experimental design and methodologies, and how you're going to lead to robust and unbiased results. And I like the next 2 bullets, how the data will be analyzed, collected, and interpreted. And also, you'll show your maturity as an investigator if you recognize that there are challenges or speed bumps, if you will, or potential problems in what you're proposing, but you will come up with alternate strategies and benchmarks for success. So, for instance, we don't expect to see X, Y, and Z, but if we do, we're going to address it by doing A, B, and C. We expect at the 6-month point to have done 57 biomarker assays and so forth. It shows that you really thought things through at a very granular level, and also you have sort of plan Bs or plan Cs, if you will, if things don't go according to plan. And of course, they don't usually go according to plan. Sex is a biological variable, and any preliminary studies, any pilot data that you have that demonstrates, it's important, that demonstrates the feasibility of what you're proposing. And then the respective contributions. So this should be a process between you and your mentor in writing this grant application. It's just not you by yourself. You don't want to say, she didn't help me at all, because the reviewers are going to think, boy, if she didn't help you with the application, how is she going to help you for the next 3 years? So you write it, then you discuss it, you make changes, editorial suggestions, you go back and rewrite it, and so forth. It's a learning process for you. And the selection of the sponsor and the institution. Why did you come to her? Why did you want to work in her lab? Why did you want to work at that institution? I mean, for graduate students, it's probably somewhere in your graduate application, but 1 page. What are the resources and the environment and the career development support for you at that institution? Training in the responsible conduct of research. There's been some recent notice issued, but what are the topics that are discussed? How often does it meet? What format is the training? How is your mentor involved in your training in the responsible conduct of research? And then very important is the 6-page document that your mentor and co-mentor put together, showing what they are going to do for you and how they are going to support you during this research training period, and how they are going to support you as you successfully transition to the next career stage. Look at bullet number 1. What funding do they have to support your research? So if they don't, maybe bring in a co-mentor, right? Because the fellowship does not provide research funding. If you have more than one mentor and co, how are they coordinating their roles or integrating their roles? Does somebody have responsibility for one part and the other one have responsibility for something else? Who have they mentored in the past? Pick 5. Where are they now? Demonstrating that they have a history of being a mentor, a history of mentoring people at your career stage and helping them successfully transition to the next career stage. What's the training plan, right? This should sort of mirror, if you will, what you wrote in your personal statement section, right? And it's not supposed to be template language. It's supposed to be about you and your needs for career development, your needs for the research program, your needs to transition to the next career stage. And this should, in a sense, overlap, right? The courses you're going to take, the conferences you're going to go to, the specific skills and techniques that you're going to learn. The training environment, any professional development, grant writing, or writing, generally speaking, for going to conferences, learning to give presentations, and how the research training plan transition to the next career stage. Very important. Who else are they going to mentor at the same time? If they're mentoring 25 other people at the same time, really, how much face time are you going to get? And then finally, section E, their appraisal of your qualifications for a successful research career. Additional requirements if it's a clinical trial. And then these letters of support from collaborators, up to 6 pages. These are not confidential letters, but these are folks who maybe are an advisory role, a co-investigator, collaborator, director of a core facility that you're going to use, somebody that's going to send you some special research resource, some special cell line, some patient derived samples or access to a database. You want to show that you're ready to go, everything is set up when the award is made. And description of the institutional environment. You have 1 page at this point, or sorry, 2 pages at this point to describe how this is the right institution environment, both technically as well as in terms of career development for this fellowship and to advance your training. If you're a student, maybe go to your Office of Graduate Affairs. If you're a postdoc, go to your Office of Postdoctoral Affairs. They probably have information. If you're a student, a pre-doc or an MD PhD student, there should also be a page written by the director of your research training program, addressing all of these different issues, where you are in the research training. You've had your qualifying exam, you meet every 6 months or so with your dissertation committee, whatever it is. And this is usually written by the research training, the doctoral program director. And then finally, description of the candidate's contribution to program goals. So this is, let's say, if someone was applying to the diversity F31, this would be an institutional document documenting that they met the eligibility criteria. Now, all the things that I mentioned have page limits, and it's really hard to fit everything into the page limit. There is this other section, you'll see there, number 10, facilities and other resources. And this is a section also in the application outside of the fellowship component, where you doesn't have a page limit and you can include a lot of other information. So I would say break it down into 2 sections, the scientific and technical resources, and you probably would get that from your mentor because he or she has that in their own R01 application. And then a career development resources, no page limit. So you could talk about all the things that you sort of mentioned, but didn't have enough room to go into in detail in the different other sections, your background and your training program, the sponsor and the training program that they have outlined for you, the institutional environment. Now you can't use it to get around the page limit, but you can provide more detail. The career development programs, the formal didactics, other workshops and so forth that are part of your career development activities. The beginning part talks about the technical section, and this will talk about the career development section. Now, there is these confidential letters of reference. These are folks that know you well from a research perspective, and will send independently through NIH Commons their letters of reference. 3 to 5, right? If you have 3 is the minimum, but if you have 4 or 5, ask 4 or 5 people to do it. And they talk about how they know you. They know you from a research perspective, how you were very successful during the course of this research project, and how they're convinced that you will continue to be a success in research. You need to include a cover letter where you would say who are providing these letters, these confidential letters, because they're not submitted with the application. And finally, the NIH Biosketch. There is a separate Biosketch, and this is a recent update. There is a separate Biosketch for pre-docs, for pre-doc and postdoc applications, for fellowship applications. Make sure that you, as the applicant, the pre-doc or the postdoc, use the correct Biosketch. Everybody else that gives you a Biosketch, the mentor, or the other collaborators and co-investigators, they use the usual Biosketch, but you must use the fellowship application. Make sure the format is correct. Here is a note that a student got that they, somebody, in fact, I think it was the mentor that didn't use the right format. They could have decided not to review the application. Thankfully, they reviewed the application and they got funded. But make sure the Biosketches that are given to you, the correct format and are current. And I would say these are sort of standalone documents. Put everything that's relevant, your training, your honors and awards. I'm going to give you an example. Even though you talk about yourself in that personal statement, everything should be in this document. The reviewers use it to assess you as the applicant, as well as your mentor and your collaborators, and that they can fulfill the role that you've described for them in the application. They have the expertise, they have the training, and so forth. So for the fellowship application, there are sort of four main sections: the personal statement, positions, honors, appointments, and so forth. Contributions to science, it's sort of a paragraph. I'll give you an example, and scholastic performance. So that would be courses and grades. They give you a template, a word template, and here's an example that they've given you. So here's the individual. There's the places that they've received their PhD or going to get their PhD and their bachelor degree. And here's their personal statement. They talk about from the very beginning why they got interested in biomedical research in high school. They tell you that they were the recipient of diversity funding from the NIH. They then talk about the research that they were involved in as an undergraduate. In fact, they got listed on a publication and they gave a poster presentation. Then they talk about their research as a graduate student, career development activities and research technical training that they received. They say some sort of personal statement that they were first in their family to graduate from college. And then they start with high school, and then they end with a statement of what their long-term career goals are: to be an academic investigator. And here, the positions, scientific appointments, honors, and then they go through all of their different research: high school, undergraduate, and graduate, and so forth. And just to go through this, they talk about, even though they're a high school student, they talk about the purpose of that funding, research experience. They talk about their role. I set up the in vitro cultures, their role in that research project. They talk about the findings of that research project, and they added this part about we were excited. And notice that that number one right there, that's not a peer-reviewed publication. That's a presentation at a conference. So it doesn't only have to be for each contribution. You're allowed to cite up to 4 research products. They don't have to be peer-reviewed journal articles. They can be conference proceedings or poster presentations, databases that you created or whatever. Up to 4 for each of the 5 contributions to science. And then there are the grades, graduate school and undergraduate. And here are some of all the different URLs for the pages that I went to. Let me just take a sip, maybe answer a couple of questions. What are some examples of benchmarks or milestones for success? So I'm going to give you an example, of the timeline. That you expect to, let's say, recruit X number of patients, or done the experiment with Y number of mice, or done a number of assays, or so forth. Somebody asked whether to do paragraphs or bullet points. Sometimes things can be represented better in table format, right? And realizing the reviewers read page after page of text, things that can be broken up in some kind of figure. I think they would welcome it, if you will. Somebody said about how would you list your contributions to science that aren't from school? For instance, if you worked for a few years at Research Institute before graduate school, sure, that's one of your contributions to science. If you worked at a company or you worked as a tech someplace, sure, that's one of your contributions to science. Absolutely. And talk about your role and the findings and so forth. All right, so let me go on to the next section, and hopefully then I have answered some of the questions. So what are generally, and I've spoken now at a very granular level, and there was a lot of material, but I think you can appreciate that there was a lot of material to cover. So what are some general ideas with regard to best practices for competitive applications? So identify the funding mechanism. So today we're talking about the NIH fellowship applications, and then prepare to complete the application. So I wouldn't say that I know too much about college football, but I like the slide. It's not the will to win, but the will to prepare to win that makes the difference. So just don't start writing the grant application. Think about, begin to prepare to write. Think about what will make the application more competitive. Talk to the program officer at the funding agency. See if you know anybody that's received one of these grants. Talk to them about the application process. Ask to see the application. That would be great to see a successful application. Maybe ask to see the reviewer's comments. Will give you an insight into what the reviewers are looking for. Make sure you know the reviewer's criteria. That's why I went through them in so much detail today. Make sure you understand the agency review process. That's why I went through it in so much detail today about making sure that you end up in the right study section. Think about what will make the application more competitive. Are there any research or career development arrangements that you should have set up? Who should be your mentors? Who should be the collaborators and the co-investigators? What core facilities will you need? Who should you get letters of support from? The directors of those core facilities, or somebody who's sending you something important? How would you strengthen the application by including more preliminary data? I happen to think preliminary data is very important. It demonstrates feasibility. It also demonstrates that you can do it. It demonstrates that you and your mentor together can successfully do it. Look at the results we got with 8 mice. Isn't this incredible and exciting? Send money, if you will, so we can do it with 80 mice, if you will, as opposed to trust us. We don't have any data, but trust us, it'll work out. Okay, maybe you shouldn't go in for that first deadline, right? Maybe you should wait another 4 months, right? There's 3 deadlines a year. Maybe you will strengthen the application tremendously if you give yourself another 4 months and are able to generate more preliminary work. And think about who's going to write those 3 to 5 confidential letters of reference. You don't want to sort of spring it on them with a week to go. As we talked about, maybe have more than one mentor, have a co-mentor. We always suggest having an advisory committee. Who are the collaborators and co-investigators? Are other institutions involved? What can you do to make the research proposed multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary? Include a table like this showing that you've surrounded yourself, if you will, with a team of folks that are supporting you during this research training program, and they each have different areas of expertise that are going to lend and help with their role in advancing your career and research. And then begin to meet with everybody so everybody understands what their role and responsibilities are. What parts are they going to write, if they are going to write any administrative or regulatory issues? Are there other institutions involved? Are human subjects involved? What core facilities or shared equipment? Go meet with the directors of those facilities. And then when you've laid everything out and everything is in place, then you're ready to go. And then you can begin to work on the grant application. Read the instructions. Nothing can be more important than read the instructions. Identify the different components of the application. Okay, and people ask me to put together a list of the components of an application. And I say, you know what, why don't you put together the checklist and the list of components, and then I will review it. Because just by the act of putting together the checklist and the list of components, you will learn so much about the application. And then when you put together this checklist and the different components, think about the sequence that you're going to complete them. It might not be the sequence that they're listed in the application, because I got to do section C, if you will, before I do section B. I need to know the biostatistics before I do X, Y, and Z. And make sure you put together dates, right? Work from the deadline and work backwards. So you have these different points that you know you need to meet. And make sure everybody knows what their responsibilities are. This person's writing the bioinformatics section. This one person's writing the imaging section and so forth. You want to get these letters of support. Nobody is writing those letters of support. You draft them. Now that's more work for you, but then the letters will say what you want them to say. And then they're more apt to get them signed and in time. Make sure you know the page limits, right? Everything, nearly everything I said has page limits. Then get on everybody's calendar, set up those meetings, right? So that you're not chasing them down. We're meeting every Thursday at 10:30. Even these little things like what fonts are you using, right? Everybody should use the same font. So when you put things together, you don't go over the page limit. And make sure everybody knows their milestones, their responsibilities in terms of writing. Read the instructions. Never assume that the reviewers know what you mean. If it's important in more than one section, say it in more than one section, right? It's okay if you say things more than once. As a new investigator, you want to demonstrate to the reviewers that you know the field and you know how your research is going to push the field forward. Refer to the literature thoroughly and thoughtfully. Explicitly state the rationale of your project. The hypothesis of my study is X, Y, and Z. We talked about this. Discuss any limitations or challenges and how you're going to overcome them. Alternate approaches. We don't expect to see X, Y, and Z, but if we do, we're going to address it by doing A, B, and C. Include well-designed tables and figures. Think about them reading page after page and page. If something can be represented in a table or a figure, do it. You know, if you use an outline, as I said in I think almost the first slide, it will read better, it'll be organized, it'll be more pleasant for the reviewers to read. Give it to folks who are pseudo reviewers to read. Now, these are not individuals that are next to you in the bench who've heard you talk about this for the last 3 years. Because that's not the reviewers. These are people who sort of understand what you're talking about, but haven't heard it before. So if there's any gaps in logic or something is missing, they will tell you because they're sort of reviewers. And try to see the application from a reviewer's perspective. So what do I mean about some of these points? So in terms of tables and figures, with the figure, include a caption that says some information, not just like figure 1. Figure 1 demonstrates at X, so that when they're looking at it, they get sort of the picture and the take-home message, if you will. Don't make it too complicated. There's 12 panels and 4 lines in each panel. It's too complicated. Then they might not print it in color. All right. Don't rely too much on color. They can't tell the difference in their version between the pink line and the red line, if you will. Make sure it's got to be easy for them to read and understand. Don't make it too small. Sometimes you can make the figure smaller, but then the text gets so small, they really can't read it anymore. And a figure that you've created for an oral or poster presentation on the same data might not be appropriate for the grant application. You're not there talking about it. It might be too cluttered or too complex for the grant application. I would say, try to put the figure and the text that explains it in detail on the same page so their eye can go back and forth between one and the other, and then bold label it figure 4. So when they're looking at the figure, they know exactly where to go to get more detailed text. What do I mean about see the application from the reviewer's perspective? I don't know how many of you might be familiar with this movie called E.T., and it was about this extraterrestrial that went to live with this family of kids for a while. And it's a very cute movie. But unlike most movies that are not really shot in order, this movie was shot in order because the young actors, found it confusing to shoot scenes out of order. Well, the way applications are submitted now, you write one component, you upload it on the web. You write another component, you upload it on the web, or you give it to a research administrator. You never really look at the application in an integrated sort of composite way. It's just pieces. So for instance, I've read many pieces of the application where somebody will say, I need to take bioinformatics for specific aim 1. And I say, they don't know what specific aim 1 is. They haven't come to it yet. It's 35 pages later. Or I say, in the personal statement, you didn't talk about some of the things that are in your biosketch. And they go, well, it's in my biosketch. I said, but your biosketch is 52 pages later. They haven't come to it. So try to think about, how does the reviewer look at the application, right? Before it was electronic, you would even manually paginate, and you really could see what the application looked like literally from start to finish, as opposed to in pieces. Maybe put a timeline like this, showing that the work can be done over 3 years. You see there, I wrote summary of specific aim 1A. I didn't write specific aim 1A. You just need to give them some information. So here's a timeline showing that it can take place over 3 years, and maybe add some milestones. One of the questions had to do with milestones. So here, put some milestones at different points and say what the milestones are. We're going to do X number of biomarkers at such and such a point. We're going to do Y number of assays, recruited X number of patients, whatever, at these different points. So you know that perhaps things are going well, or maybe not so well at these different points. You want to be able to say yes to all these points. You want to think about every question that the reviewers can have and address them in the application. It's not your thesis defense. You're not in the room. Don't do the minimum, right? Optional doesn't mean don't do. So that study section request form that I showed you, it's not a requirement, but boy, it's a good thing to do. For the fellowship applications, you get, if you have 4 or 5 great letters, why would you only submit 3? Why? These letters of support, those 6 pages, is not a requirement, but to show that you've got everything lined up and these collaborators and core facilities, that's a good thing for the application. Take advantage of it. Here I saw a K application and they only wrote a half a page about the institutional environment. Say everything you possibly can about where you're doing your research and your career development in that one page. Avoid the 3 Ds, day of deadline drama. Okay, these are all real things that happened. A required component was missing, or another component was missing, wasn't required, but it would have made the application more competitive. Just realize that involved human subjects. This many times happens with basic scientists. They're using tissue of human origin, and they didn't know that they met the formal definition of research with human subjects. There's some other research compliance issue. There's an international institution involved. There's a problem with the budget. There's a problem with the signature. There's some problem with the formatting requirements. You went over the page limit for some reason, right? Try to have the application ready before the last day. Here was an email, right? Urgent, due today before 5 p.m. Must be done by 5 p.m. and 10 minutes to go, right? Lots of drama. I like this slide. Not everything that can be counted counts. And so this is sort of, I would say, the quantitative aspect of the application. In the research section, what data should you include? You and your mentor decide. And not everything that counts can be counted. And this is more the qualitative section, if you will, where you talk about yourself and your research background and your research interests and your research aspirations. You want to come off at these 4 points. And when you talk about your background and you talk about those previous research experiences, talk about why you chose that research group and what was the hypothesis and what was your role and why was the project important and what were the findings and what did you accomplish? And then as you transition to another research experience, whether at another institution, why did you do that? How did your interests evolve? And any papers that came out with your name on it, or abstract proceedings, and any recognition or honors and so forth. What are possible problems? We sort of touched on this with mentors. They're too busy to mentor you. They have too many other administrative or clinical, or they're mentoring too many other people, right? Or they're not a match research-wise or scientifically. They're too junior. Maybe bring in a more senior co-mentor, if you will. They don't have a lot of research experience. They don't have a lot of funding to support your research? What are problems with the institution? It's not a good fit scientifically or technically, or they don't have career development opportunities for you at this career stage and to help you transition to the next career stage. Besides funding, diversity and inclusion are important. Role models are important. Mentors are important. Colleagues are important. Be open to new ideas and challenges. Take advantage of unique opportunities that come about when you're least expecting it. And networking is important. So hopefully we'll all be able to get back to going to conferences and meeting people and forming new collaborations. This is a recent webpage that NIH just put out at the beginning of this month about from the reviewers of common issues that they found with grant applications. I think it's helpful. I also have my own list of common problems for new investigators. Doesn't follow the funding agency's mission or specific instructions for that funding program or budget. It's too much. It's overly ambitious, time-wise, money-wise, resources-wise, career level-wise. It's just not a match with that particular program. I think the next thing is it's a fishing expedition. You're just looking for the data. It's descriptive. It's not mechanistic. It's not hypothesis-driven. You run a gel looking for a dot here. That's not a dot there. And why is there a dot? I mean, it's not defined by an underlying sort of questions that you want to ask. I think it's good to have preliminary data. It demonstrates the feasibility of the project. It also demonstrates that the junior investigator can demonstrate this strong preliminary data, if you will. There's something wrong with the study design. You don't have the right control group, the right different arms in the study. It's unfocused, if you will. It's all about diabetes somehow, but not tied together by some common themes. Problems with the rigor and reproducibility, the statistics, the power analysis, the data analysis. So there's some special research resource that you need. You haven't demonstrated that you'll have access to it. The budget doesn't match what you're proposing. The methodologies are beyond the expertise of the research team. Bring in a collaborator that's an expert in that methodology that you or your mentor might not have. And this is especially important for postdocs as they transition to the next career stage as a faculty member. As I mentioned, one summer I worked as a review administrator. Now I didn't take this picture, but I asked to see the mailroom, and this is when the applications were still hard copy. And it's just piles and piles of FedEx boxes and like the world's biggest Xerox machine. So realize that your application is not there, but in fact, your application is back there. And you need to make it stand out to these reviewers. So in my final slides, think about these poor reviewers, and they have all these applications to review as well as their own applications and papers they're writing and their other responsibilities. So, you know, they sort of, let's say, separate the applications. It's going to be a bunch that'll probably get funded and a bunch that probably won't. And the vast majority of the applications are in the middle. And if there was unlimited amount of money, they would all get funded because they're fine applications, if you will. But there isn't an unlimited amount of money to support all these fine applications. So they do what reviewers do, and they have to find something wrong. So there's a problem with some of the statistics of some of the applications, or some unique research resource is not adequately described in how they're going to obtain it. So those are going to go. Or there's a problem with the career development or research training plan. They didn't deal with it in as much detail as they should have. They spent a lot of time on the research part, but not on the career development or training part. So they go. And this one figure caption is too small, but it's just to say that the figure got so small that it really wasn't informative anymore, and it really didn't help the application. So those go. So in the end, you want to sort of be the last one standing where they couldn't find anything wrong with your application. And finally, good luck. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing and thank you all for and listening to this presentation. I realize there's a lot of information. It's very detail oriented, but I think the complexity of the application warrants having such a detailed presentation. Should I take questions or
Let's see if there's more questions. We have 30 minutes for questions.
okay. So somebody it was asking about, sort of what pronoun to use, and in the personal section, you can use I. It is very personal. And you talk about that this is, and sometimes people say very personal things about why they went into biomedical research. So I did this and I did that. And you can also use in the research section, we were going to look at this, we've done this, we demonstrated that kind of thing. I would say that, you sort of have to have a mentor and you need to have a research project to put into the application. I'm sorry, I'm reading as I'm talking. Are the people writing your letters of recommendation, should they be from your institution? They can be from your institution. It's even stronger. This is a good question. It's even stronger if they're from another institution because they look more independent, if you will. They just cannot be involved in the research that's proposed in the application. So I usually say, generally speaking, you can go down one career level. So graduate students would maybe ask for letters from people that they had major research experiences with as an undergraduate, or if you had some gap years where you did research someplace else, working someplace else. Postdocs usually would include a letter from their PhD mentor or their dissertation mentor. And certainly if you're collaborating with somebody or know somebody from another institution that knows your work and would write a good, strong letter, that would be an even stronger letter because here's somebody that is not involved in the current application, in the current research, but is giving you a strong letter. Let me go to the Q&A. Lots of good so, the question is, are GPA and GRE scores important? I think you list your grades in your courses in the Biosketch. I would also say that if there's some period, when there was, let's say, something that impacted your productivity or a period of time that impacted your grades, then say so. It's okay. Say it in the personal statement, say it in the section with the grades and so forth. I think the reviewers would appreciate it. There's a question here. Can one insert a URL link for a core facility in the resources section? I hate to say it, but absolutely not. One is not allowed to include, except for one exception, which I'll tell you, URLs, embedded URLs or explicit URLs anywhere in the application. The only place you can do that is a URL to a government site that lists all your publications. I'm afraid that if they saw a URL anyplace else in the application, unless specifically allowed by the funding announcement, your application would not get reviewed. Is an F31 only for graduate students who want to do a postdoc and go into fact? The F31 is for graduate students who are funded while they're in graduate school. The F32 is for individuals that are individuals while they are F30, while they are postdocs. Somebody said are T31 and T32, I think you mean F, are they submitted through the NIH website? Yes, you should go talk to your department or your division or your center's research administration about how they submit applications. They are submitted, you upload the documents to a web page, and then your institution's grants office hits the submit button after reviewing the components of the application. There cannot be URLs in the reference, no URLs anywhere except one URL on individuals' biosketches, which must be a government site listing their publications, no other URLs, or it won't be reviewed. Let's see. Can you discuss COVID, the impact affecting our studies? Absolutely. You can put that in the section A of your biosketch. Your mentor can mention why things, your institution, everybody went home for a while. Maybe there were problems with the supply chain. Absolutely. You can talk about it in section A, and it doesn't hurt for the mentor to mention it, and so forth. If somebody says, could teaching in a community college be included as a contribution to science? You're up to 5 that you're allowed on the biosketch. Trying to can a permanent resident apply for NIH F31, F32? Yes, it's permanent resident or US citizen. Regarding the K99 R00, I haven't spoken about it today, but the R00 can be at any institution, the same place you held the K99 or someplace else. What year in graduate school is the F31 usually submitted? So that's a good question. I would ask in your graduate school. I would say that it's frequently the F31 is submitted after you have a mentor. Maybe you have some preliminary data. Maybe you've passed your dissertation. It depends upon the program, your PhD program, but many times it's submitted around the time, many times that you pass your qualifying exam, if you will. You have a mentor, you have some preliminary data, you have an idea of your dissertation research. It's very different than the NSF Predoc Fellowship, which is usually for more junior predocs. Sorry, I'm scrolling while reading. The question is, what is the likelihood of receiving funding for a qualitative study? Would you recommend focusing on mixed method study to remain competitive? I think it's sort of important that it's hypothesis driven, that you're asking and answering a question, that you recognize where the field is right now and how your research will move the field forward and will make an impact. Please keep adding your the letters of recommendation submitted individually by the reviewers, option of blinding the LOR, or they submitted a one big application bundle by the applicant. So they are submitted independently by, these are the confidential letters of reference, right? The people who know you from a research perspective. Maybe you did an undergraduate research experience with them, or your PhD and your postdoc, and they were your mentor for your PhD. They submit their letters individually through NIH Commons. They need to know, you need to give them 2 sets of instructions. One is what should be in the letter, and I've given you the link of what should be in the letter. And basically it is how they know you, how they're convinced that you will continue to succeed in academic research. And the second set of instructions is how to technically submit the letter. And basically what they need to know is your name, your Commons ID, and also which funding announcement, PA- one of those numbers. They submit it, and then their letter will be attached to your application in NIH Commons, and the reviewers will have access to those letters. And they put a significant amount of weight on those letters. You will not be able to see those letters. You will be able to see in Commons that the letters have been received, but you can't open the letters. And that's why it's important that fellowship applications must include a cover letter, so that if there's any internet snafu, and I haven't heard of any, you'll have gone on record that you're expecting these letters from these particular individuals. So let's take a look at some more questions. Keep putting it in, and keep adding if I haven't addressed your question, there's a lot to go through, so feel free to put it in again if you want. Is there any exclusion criteria regarding postdocs experience years to apply for K00 and F32? I don't quite understand that that question. The K00 goes with the F99, so one really applies for the F99 first, and then after the up to 2 years of the F99 is over, then the K00 kicks in. So and the F32 is for postdocs, and the F99 is folks that are transitioning from graduate student to postdoc. Where do we put the GRE scores? I don't think that the GRE scores are a requirement. I could be mistaken, but I don't think they are a requirement. Do you think it's okay to have some achievements described more in depth on the paragraph portion? I think that you mean section A of the Biosketch, and then have other things listed as bullet points. I think you mean contributions to science. I think the section A, the personal statement part of the Biosketch, I think you can do sort of a summary sentences and then maybe some highlights. I would try not to go over onto the second page. I don't think the reviewers would like so much to turn to the second page. How important are a number of published articles for receiving a Predom Fellowship? I don't think that there's a defined number of publications that's required. I think the reviewers just like to see that in previous research experiences, these were good research training experiences, that you learned something, and maybe you got some recognition. I don't think they expect an undergraduate to be a first author of a journal article, but that, maybe you were involved in a poster, maybe you were a middle author. And if you can describe the project, describe the role, your contribution, maybe key findings, I think that's important. So the answer to F31 for MDs was no. So if you already have a doctoral degree, including an MD, if you already received the MD, you would be applying for an F32 because you would be a postdoc. If you were in an MD PhD program and were doing the research years of your MD PhD, you could apply for the F30, or if your institute didn't have an F30, you could apply for the F31. I think I've answered that question. if I complete my first year of postdoc in July, if I apply for NIH postdoc in August, I will have 3 years to complete the proposed research, or 2 years. You could submit the postdoc for 3 years, and let's say you get it. But let's say that you find a job, or you finish the postdoc. You don't have to stay for the 3 years of the postdoc if you find a job and you've decided to move on. You just would end the F32 early, but at least you would have the funding in case you didn't find a job. So one doesn't have to stay to the end of the degree, the end of the grant. So let's say it's a pre-doc and you have, let's say, a 4 or 5 year F31, but you've graduated. That's great. You just would end the grant early. You don't have to stay to the end. Is there a diversity application? There's only a diversity, a dedicated diversity program for the F31. There isn't a diversity funding announcement, diversity specific for the F30 or for the F32, unless some specific institute has issued one, but there is no parent announcement specific to enhance the diversity for the F30 or the F32. Somebody was asking about success rates between K01s, K99, F32s. If you go on NIH's webpage into NIH report, there is a section called success rates, and they have success rates. And I showed you some information of every fellowship program, every K program. And you can sort by institute, and you can go back 10 years. So on NIH's report series, there is a section on success rates. There are these massive Excel documents that you can open, and you can see the success rate for all of these different programs. Can I change the length of my proposal fellowship on resubmission in response to the reviewer's comments that it was too compressed? Absolutely. And how should you mark up the resubmission? So this is a good series of questions, because of course, the vast majority of people don't get funded the first time, and you will submit what's called an amended application or resubmission. You will fill out that section 1 introduction. I didn't go through it, but there is a 1-page introduction where you respond to the reviewer's comments. This is another reason why the grant needs to end up in the right study section from the beginning, because the resubmitted applications will go back to exactly the same study section. So if it was in the wrong study section the first time, it's in the wrong study section the second time. So when you respond to the reviewer's comments, think about all of those weaknesses. I would even say cut and paste the weaknesses, if you will, from the reviewer's comments and put it in your Word document, and group the ones that are the same from reviewer 2 and reviewer 3, and from reviewer 1 and reviewer 3, and group them together and put them in the Word document, just so when you're writing, you make sure that you're comprehensive and responding. And you start by thanking the reviewers for their considered review, and the resulting application is stronger as a result. And then go through each of their weaknesses. And my general thought is that whatever they've asked, do it. Just whatever, unless it's some sort of scientific fact and some paper has come out in the interim between your application and now the resubmission. But otherwise, if they, like the example that somebody gave in the Q&A, where they thought that there was, I guess, too much proposed for too short a period of time, then change that. If they think you should take more courses, or they think you should do a different control or whatever, just you never be argumentative, and just be more collaborative and responsive and respectful for their comments. And as a general comment, whatever they want, you respond positively. And then in most cases, not 100% of the cases, but in most cases, you will get a better score. Let's see, any other? I think if you've been a postdoc for 6 months, should you apply for an F32 or K grant? I think it depends upon how much preliminary data you have, how close the reviewers will think you are to independence, because let's say for the K99 R00, one needs to be between 1 to 2 years of independence. A K grant like a K01 is generally 4 or 5 years long. Do you need 4 or 5 more years of mentor training with that mentor? So I think those are the questions to ask when deciding whether to apply for an F32, a K99 or a K01. How close are you to independence? How many more years of research, of mentored research training do you need with that mentor that you have? So feel free to add more things, more questions. I think I'm trying to address them all. Please feel free, if you don't think I answered your question, please, if you don't mind putting it in again, because there are many and I'm trying to go through them, if you will. Is the PHS assignment request form submitted with the rest of the proposal? Yes, absolutely. But the reviewers don't see it. So it's an optional form. You need to tell your research administrator or your pre-award administrator who's ever helping you put together the application. They have to activate the form, if you will. I think it's in the top left of the assist so that you have access. Because it's an optional form, it's not readily available when you open the assist. So you would complete it. It would get sent when the rest of the application gets sent. You will then see it in your Commons site, but the reviewers won't see it. It's an administrative document. The same thing with your cover letter, where you list who is writing those confidential letters of reference. It's an administrative document. It's not seen by the reviewers. So somebody who said something about they applied for an F31 and the reviewers commented they didn't take any courses. One of the issues is that the F31 is not only to do research, but it's also for didactic activities and to learn. Research training is not only research, but it's also the other career development things. And perhaps there are things to learn, a skill set and a knowledge base to learn that's best learned from taking courses. And so as you saw from the chart that I put together, it's not only research to training, it's not only experiments, it's not only experimental training, but there's also courses and so forth. And many times they say they might be front loaded, but it's a whole integrated training program of experimental training as well as career development and didactic training. So somebody said, can they start their research even though the F31 hasn't been funded yet? I mean, sure, you can start your research if you have somebody that's going to support that research. Sure. I mean, people don't stop and wait for their research, for their dissertation research while they hear back from NIH. Sure. The example that was given that had to do, I think, with research with human subjects. So of course you would need IRB approval. If it was research with laboratory animals, you would need IACUC approval. But people don't hold off on their research if your mentor will pay for it. Maybe you're on a training grant and then get the F and you transition to the F, or you're on your mentor's research grant and then you transition to the F once the F comes in, but you're continuing to do your research. This is a good question. Are there different program officers for F awards than they are for research grants? So the program officers are at the institutes, Cancer Institute, Eye Institute, so forth, not at the Center for Scientific Review. And they are not the same as the R program officers. There are program officers specifically that deal with training awards, Fs, Ks, Ts, and so forth. So they specifically deal with people applying for these training awards. And you can look them up on the different institutes webpage. And once you apply, you can see who they are. They'll be listed in comments, who the program officer is, who the grants management is. Can you apply before you've started at a particular institution? So you have to check with that institution, but many times somebody can apply, but it's a done deal that you're going. Right? It's signed, you're going, you'll be there, let's say starting March 1st. And if you apply now or whatever, the award would start July 1st. So you will be there and on board already if the award is made. So in that case, it's usually okay to apply, even though when the application went in. However, without having preliminary data, while you technically can apply, it might not be the strongest application because you don't have preliminary data. I generally feel that unless it's a kind of funding program that says no funding, no preliminary data allowed, and there are some of those, it's best to have preliminary data. It shows feasibility. It shows that the project is doable. It shows that the project gets interesting results. And it shows that this mentor-mentee relationship works because together they've generated this interesting data. So the question is, and this is a good question, does the primary mentor need to be affiliated with the postdoc's current institution? Does the primary mentor need to have current NIH funding? I mean, I think that the mentor-mentee relationship is a special relationship. And how does somebody mentor somebody if they're not at the same institution? And the question came up with funding. Well, what's paying for the research costs? Right? If the mentor doesn't have an NIH or similar type of grant. So these are the cases where we'd bring in another mentor, another co-mentor. But you want to think about all these things that strengthen the application. If all these questions that you're raising is because that lots of these questions in the chat, many of the questions of the chat, because I think maybe after my presentation, people think of all these different relationships and arrangements that maybe are not the best, that don't strengthen the application. So, one thought is how to mitigate those kinds of things, right? While technically allowable, maybe they don't strengthen the application and maybe they should be changed to strengthen the application because the reviewers are going to be looking for a strong and productive relationship between the mentee and the mentor. If I didn't answer your question, please add it again to the chat. You know, there's a difference between what's allowed technically and what makes for a competitive application. If I didn't answer your question, please put it back in the chat because there's so many to scroll through right now. One needs to be a US citizen, permanent resident to apply for these Fs. Oh, let me put it a different way. I think you need to have a permanent residency or citizenship at the time of award. It is possible, I believe, to apply if you're not yet a citizen or permanent resident, but will be at the time of award. You just need to double check that. I know of somebody who applied for a K before they were a permanent resident, but then became a permanent resident while the application was being reviewed. Lots of great questions. Obviously, people are thinking about things in a lot of detail because there's very specific questions. Any more questions? What if I'm applying for a grant that I haven't explicitly worked in the field of, hence don't have a working relationship with an appropriate mentor? Can all mentors be from the institutions that I haven't worked with yet? I'm not quite sure what that means, but I think it's important that the reviewers get a feeling that the mentee and the mentor have a strong relationship together, and it will be productive. I think that's what they're looking for. They've been productive in the past, and they will continue to be productive. You can talk about the things that you've already done together, and then you can continue to do. I would say one of the exceptions is that NINDS F32, but generally speaking, these applications are not de novo applications. The question was about non-US citizens. I gave you an example about the American Heart Association. So how do non-US citizens, permanent residents, find fellowship applications that they can apply for? So many times the non-government agencies, like the American Heart example that I gave you, does not have a citizenship requirement. So my suggestion is to talk to people in your field, talk to other postdocs. Many institutions also have funding opportunity databases that you can search on for keyword fields or select citizenship and so forth. And so ask at your institution if you have these databases. And I gave you an example of one, that American Heart, that doesn't have a citizenship requirement, but you know, the application and the review criteria look very similar to NIH's. And certainly everything I said about what to make the different components, what to put in all the different components, and best practices for competitive applications would apply for whether it was an NIH application or somebody else's application, somebody else's fellowship application. And thank you to everybody that's putting nice comments about the presentation in the chat. I appreciate it. think we're a little over time. I don't see any new questions unless I've missed them.
Does anybody have any last minute questions before we wrap up?
Thank you to everybody who's saying thank you. Thank you right back. Thank you for participating in this, I would say, very detailed. My presentations tend to be very detailed, but I think there's so much information to be able to put together, develop a competitive application and what to look for, what to think about. So thank you to everybody who's saying thank you. I'm very appreciative.
Awesome. Well, if nobody has any other questions, all right, I guess we'll start wrapping up. So again, we want to thank Dr. Rubin so
My
much
pleasure.
for participating. We really do appreciate this conversation, this discussion. You shared some really important information. Just a reminder, we will be sending out the slides and the recording to the email you registered with, and then we'll be posting in our YouTube channel as well. So you'll be able to catch the recording and the slides in your email and on YouTube. But yes, we look forward to hosting more webinars in this series, and just thank you everybody for attending, and we hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.